Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to our conversation. My name is Elīna Lange-Ionatamišvili. I represent the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. And today, here with me, I have Michael Bociurkiw, who is a global affairs analyst, also writer and author. He's authored the book Digital Pandemic, which I hope you have already read or will do. And he's also a frequent commentator on major international global media outlets. Michael, thank you so much for flying to us all the way from Canada.
Pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I think you and I were both old enough to still remember the world without smartphones and without social media. It was quite a different world and how people consumed information and also how people interacted with each other. Also, the politics at the time were quite different. So my first question to you will be to you as a global affairs analyst. How do you feel how digitalization and social media has changed politics of the day on international scale and also domestic politics?
Well, it's a great question. And again, thank you for having me. Well, let's not forget that, and you're right, we are old enough to remember life before the internet, probably life with a rotary dial telephone as well. But we must remember that, the internet was originally created for good and to connect people. And sadly, a lot of what we see in terms of digitization and social media has turned to bad in the sense of accelerating a lot of the divisions that already exist in society. I remember actually when I went onto the internet for the first time, I was working for Asia Times in Bangkok, and it was a whole new world to us. Fast forward to 2014, I was working for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. And when MH17 was shot down by the Russians over Donetsk, we first learned about it over Twitter. We're a monitoring mission with great resources and people all over, but it was actually social media that brought us instantaneous kind of updates on what was happening. Now, I just, as you pointed out, came from North America, and domestic politics has really been impacted, I would say, again, in a negative way by social media. So we have these fault lines, the rise of authoritarianism and racism to mass migration and border disputes. And because information is now so easily accessible and manipulated, now all facts can be called into questions. And of course, who can we blame for a lot of this is former President Donald Trump. If there's anyone who kind of took social media and used it for what I call tantrum diplomacy, it was him. And this continues to happen. And now we're also seeing that leaders can actually use social media as almost a diplomatic channel. In the olden days, of course, you would have envoys around the world, ambassadors, and they would be the ones to feed you information in these long cables. In the book, my book, Digital Pandemic, I bring up the example of how technology has filled in for some of these leaders. For example, Petro Poroshenko, when he was first elected in 2014, he waited several, I would say, agonizing months before appointing ambassadors to London, Washington, Ottawa, and Canberra. And what that told us is kind of that, you can survive without these major envoys and rely on, technology, yes, social media to keep you updated. The other interesting finding I found during the pandemic, there's a chapter in the book called How Diplomacy Was Crushed, because no one was traveling anywhere, things were going on virtually. I interviewed the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, arguably the world's top humanitarian diplomat. And he told me that in terms of the ICRC's ability to solve some of these complex conflicts, it was almost impossible because you're not sitting face to face across the table, eyeball to eyeball with, for example, non-state parties or rebels or whatever you call them. And these types of things cannot be done over a Zoom call. So that was a very interesting finding. Kind of to end on this question, I should also say, and I wrote this in the book, that I think, sadly, the world has missed, an opportunity with the pandemic to leverage the pandemic for the good of humanity. And I'll just read a paragraph, if I can here. Perhaps it was naive to expect humanity to turn a global crisis into an opportunity for mending bridges. a virus was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to unite against a common enemy, to embark on a process of building back better on contentious issues like fighting climate change and bridging the digital divide. That we couldn't cooperate well during this crisis, and I'm talking about issues like providing equitable distribution of the vaccines and PPE, and loosening, for example, patent protections so poor countries can make the vaccines. Well, at the end of the day, it does make me feel a bit more pessimistic about humanity's future.
Okay, so over these years that you've researched this question, you feel now more pessimistic than optimistic on the impact of technology on our lives?
Yeah, well, technology, I think, is a double-edged sword. It helps us to enable things, to do things, and but on the other hand, as we talking early this morning on another panel, it does enable the spread of fake news. There's unfettered data collection going on whenever we pick up our devices. Even when we don't pick up our devices, it's collecting information on us. And the other thing I witnessed, this was really interesting during the pandemic, is that there was one group of people who really, really loved COVID-19. You know who that was? The strong men, the autocrats, the bad guys. Why? Because they were able to leverage the pandemic to level the playing field in their favor. And they did that sometimes in very sophisticated ways, but a lot of it was using technology to put away opponents, to keep track on opponents, that sort of thing. In many cases, they throttled social media. They increased their persecution of journalists. So that we saw a lot of during the pandemic. And the other thing I found is a lot of governments, especially in Asia, during the pandemic dressed draconian digital legislation so that they can better control things. There was one more thing I wanted to say too, is that during the pandemic we had a number of uprisings. We had the one in Myanmar, of course, Belarus, Hong Kong a little bit before that. And it's interesting to watch how the two sides, the protesters and the governments, play a kind of cat and mouse game with technology. What you're seeing happening right now is a lot of protest movements are going to platforms that governments know very little about. I'm talking, for example, about TikTok, the power of the hashtag to be able to force their concerns forward, stuff like that. And there was a really good example. What we're finding also is that protest movements are kind of copying each other. So the Hong Kong protesters learned a lot from the protesters in Maidan on the revolution of dignitary in terms of how to organize themselves, how to use technology. The protesters in Myanmar followed what was going on in Hong Kong very carefully. So I'll give you a quick example, is that in Hong Kong and Myanmar, the police, for example, or the governments would monitor social media to find out what the protesters are going to do next. So what they did is they switched that out and they used Bluetooth devices so that they can communicate very in close quarters, and the police couldn't find that out. Finally, I wanted to say that this is talking about the good of technology, but imagine what it would have been like going through the pandemic without technology. We wouldn't have the ability, for example, to use these to say goodbye to loved ones or to connect with loved ones, to order food, to do distance learning, to work from home. I think we would have been paralyzed to a lot greater extent. So, it did play a very, very good role. But one last point, as I said this morning, is that during the pandemic, a lot of draconian legislation was passed. And it's up to us, those of us who live in democracies, to hold governments accountable and to make sure that a lot of these laws are lifted once public health regulations allow them to.
Yeah, exactly. Since you touched on the pandemic, you also sketched out how it changed our lives completely.
Right.
Almost changed our entire social fabric. So a lot of businesses are closing down their offices and they don't intend to reopen them because it's much cheaper and people are still productive and effective at home, et cetera, et cetera. So in your opinion, what will be the long-lasting effects that we will see coming out of the pandemic?
Well, I think the research is still out on that, but I have a lot of anecdotal evidence. And because I've been lucky, I've been able to travel quite a bit. I've collected a lot of new research. There's a lot to worry about. Let me be clear about that. One of the things, again, this is something that's difficult to research, but I worry about how long it will take for normal human contact to resume. I mean, look at us right now. We're socially distanced. We're wearing masks. We can't read our full expressions. And I got to tell you, even before the pandemic, research was already available about how children were being affected by these things, by social media, that even though their parents were maskless, the amount of time they're staring at their screens, and kids now are staring at their screens even more because of distance learning, is that when they were growing up, they had difficulty reading their parents' expressions, and they also showed less empathy. And I also worry about where I live. There's a lot of seniors there, for example, and they're going to be avoiding other people for a long time because they're so afraid of getting COVID. The other thing that's happening that I've witnessed really recently is I've been to Seattle twice, and obviously it's the home of a lot of high-tech companies. The city center has turned into a ghost town. People are working from home. A lot of them are actually afraid to come back to the city center. Now, part of that has to do with the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests, police forces being kind of shrunk because for a number of reasons there. But anyway, a lot of these city centers, including in San Francisco as well, by the way, have really been transformed. And there's no indication of when people will actually go back to those tall office towers or those big high-tech campuses. And there's a lot of services, including mom and pop shops, that service that population that came in every day, little mom and pop food stores or restaurants, things like that. A lot of them are gone, never to come back again. So I'm really worried about that. A couple maybe points about how it's done good things. I mean, we've seen incredible innovation happening. People have unbelievable, for example, retail experiences, virtual retail experiences online that they've never had before. The ability to do telehealth, the ability to learn to do distance learning. A lot of American students may not go back to university campuses and have to spend tens of thousands of dollars anymore because there's no need to be there physically anymore. And then a really good point that came up, we've also tried to amplify it in the book, is that because of COVID, a lot of people went online who needed help with, let's say, mental illness, things like that. The technology allowed them to connect with professionals or with therapists, but it also indirectly removes some of the stigma in terms of coming out and saying, well, yes, I'm dealing with some kind of mental illness and I need it dealt with. So there's some pretty good things there. If I can, at the end of the book, I hope I'm not getting too ahead of ourselves, but I put a couple of predictions there of what's going to happen up ahead. One of them is touchless commercial transactions will become the norm. I think China, which has been a pretty big topic at this conference, will be one of the first where there will be a cashless system anymore. So that's really interesting. And telehealth, as I said, will undergo a massive adoption spurt, especially in large countries where millions remain deprived of a decent standard of living. And I got to say, in this part of the world, well, maybe more so Ukraine and Russia, that was a really big thing, telehealth, because at the beginning of the pandemic, it was such a mess that people actually went to the hospital to die. They weren't receiving proper treatment, and you wanted to avoid at all costs because COVID was circulating in these medical facilities. So telehealth was actually a really good thing there. Also, I think that big tech, especially social media, is going to face greater regulations, antitrust legislation, that sort of thing. That'll be a big thing. The personal data, I was saying that we give up a lot of our data to big companies like Facebook and Google and YouTube. I'm hoping, I'm right on this one, that it'll become self-sovereign, meaning that we'll actually be able to make money from our data. China, again, from now on, brands doing business in China will be pressured to back away from social activism, keep silent on human rights abuses, and avoid criticism of the Chinese government. A couple more quick ones. New work collaboration tools will make working from home even easier than it is now. And then also in the sectors, especially of real estate, finance, health, and travel, goodbye to the middleman who raises the cost of a lot of things.
Yeah, so there are certainly many benefits. So as you said, cut out the middleman, things become cheaper. things become potentially more convenient,
Right.
such as work from home, more freedom, how you organize your time. But at the same time, when you say, only electronic money transactions, everything, our meetings, teaching, everything is digitalized, it can potentially be recorded or monitored, all the conversations. So there are also a lot of security risks,
Right.
personal and also on a, let's say, organizational or national level. So I'm not sure how to ensure this balance, because it seems that the pandemic has kind of pushed us, 10 years ahead.
About 10 years ahead.
Yeah,
I'd say.
but are we 10 years ahead also in terms of ensuring that we are secure as individuals, as organizations, and as countries?
Yeah, I actually don't think so. We aren't very secure. And a lot of countries have failed. They've not heeded the calls to build up their security defenses against cyber attacks and things like that. Look, there's one regime that loves this massive spurt towards digitization of currency. And again, that's China. Why? Because it allows them to track people a lot easier.
Precisely. Yeah.
And it feeds into this social credit score that you accumulate. So in China, you have to have a good social credit score to do everything from being admitted to school, university, travel, getting loans. And it's very interesting, a lot of people don't know this, but your social credit score in China can be affected even by if you're caught jaywalking, if you're caught littering, or even if you're caught gossiping about a neighbor. So that's incredible surveillance and incredible control. We'll see where that all goes.
But I think, on the other hand, of course, clearly China's taken it way too far. But at the same time, we are also being monitored, and all these kind of instances of breaking the law, not paying the loan back on time, and all that, it's also being recorded, and it's always being evaluated by the banks or,
Absolutely.
potentially your employer also, if they can access some form of information. So I think we just, maybe we are often very focused at looking outside, but not looking internally at what our problems and potential dangers are to our democracies.
If I can quickly, there's one chapter in the book that deals with what's called wearable technology, smart PPE. And this is being introduced in a lot more workplaces. And there's a good side to it. With technology, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. But there's a good side to it because, for example, it can monitor on an assembly line a worker's temperature, core temperature, blood pressure, things like that. So that's good. And if it goes too high, the worker is alerted. On the other hand, it's exactly that collection of data. So say, for example, a pro athlete is using smart PPE, wearable technology. Could the information that's been collected about his or her health be used, for example, in a contract negotiation?
Precisely,
So that's where the unfairness can really come in.
Exactly, that's my concern, But since we have just about 10 minutes left, let's quickly jump to a more kind of specific and very recent issue. So just earlier this month, we had the case of Facebook employee Frances Haugen testifying in front of the US Congress. And she accused Facebook of moral bankruptcy. She painted a picture of a company which is obsessed with growth and profit at the cost of its own users' well-being, and also at the cost of national security of the United States and other countries. So, hearing all this, what do you think? Is there something really that Facebook can and will do differently? Because we have these expectations, but let's be realistic. They're a business.
Right.
They are there to make profit. That's what businesses do. They also want to keep certain, secrecy of their trade secrets.
Correct.
We don't ask other businesses to just divulge all their technologies and everything. So how do we find this balance? Is it even realistic what we are expecting from Facebook?
Yeah, well, first of all, I fall on the side of what Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal said. He was the chairman of the subcommittee presiding over this. He said, Facebook knows its product can be addictive and toxic for children. They value their profit more than the pain they cause children and families. Look, even before the pandemic, I was working on another book called Digital Crack. And in that, we looked at the guts of smartphones and social media platforms, and everything that was planned in there is to make you more addictive. What do you think, for example, what we call the infinite scroll on Instagram or in Facebook is there, where you just move and move and move to see, because you never know what's around that corner. Maybe I'll just scroll a couple more minutes and I'll find something really interesting. It's like, the slot machine that you push the handle. So I interviewed an engineer from Silicon Valley, and he used to design these very addictive apps, and then he couldn't sleep at night because he knew what he was doing. So now he's, for example, invented an app where it helps you to wean yourself off of social media. So that's really interesting. Look, Facebook knows what it's doing, and I think what we need to hear from them is an admission that it is harmful, and next, what are they going to do about that? Having said that, is that it is their responsibility, they're a publicly traded company, to make maximum profits. And to make maximum profits, you have to do this kind of stuff. What makes me optimistic is in the past few months, I've been doing a lot of research on social impact investing. ESG, it's also called. And I think what's going to happen is that, and we've seen it happen before in tech, is that big investors are going to say, you know what, enough is enough. Facebook, which we've invested in, has to take more responsibility, because I've talked to some experts, and actually what we call the unlock time or the pickup time of devices for younger kids right now, exacerbated by the pandemic, has gone through the roof, where children now are almost in a totally online environment from day to night. And I think it was a rapper who said recently, the average kid now in the developed world wakes up, and by the time he or she gets out of bed, they've compared themselves to 100 other people because they're scrolling through Instagram. So that's not a very good place to be. So the other thing I should say is that we as consumers and as users of these platforms, we can also vote. We can vote with our feet and go to other platforms. It's not that easy everywhere. There are some places in the world, for example, Myanmar, Philippines, even to some extent, I would say Ukraine, where people look at Facebook as the internet. In some countries in Southeast Asia, to get on the internet, they buy a small package from Facebook, and that gives them free access. And that's their kind of cyber world. So it's very difficult to just cancel it and go off of it. So Facebook faces a real dilemma. I think they're going to have to do some internal soul searching, and make some revisions to the platform. For example, not deliberately highlighting divisive content or explosive content so people get more addicted, and fixing that algorithm. Otherwise, I think there'll be a lot more pressure on Capitol Hill for senators and congressmen to take action against them. One more quick thing. I know I'm qualifying myself a lot, but whenever you see Mark Zuckerberg and his deputies march up to Capitol Hill for their hearings, it almost seems like the tables are turned. They're the ones calling the shots rather than the legislators, but hopefully that will change too.
Right. The other thing that I wanted to ask was, during this hearing, Frances Hogan, she suggested that it would be good to create some form of an oversight body, preferably involving Congress as well, so that they oversee operation of Facebook and other social media companies. And she called for more transparency on operations and the data that Facebook holds on its users. So it all sounds well-intentioned, and from what we've discussed today, I mean, yes, something of the kind should be happening. But I'm worrying, on the other hand, where do we draw the line of any kind of government control and potential intervention into, private business?
Right.
And also for some, Facebook is the only place where they actually feel secure to express themselves. Yeah. So how do you look at that?
Yeah, well, again, these are incredibly difficult, complex problems to solve. I think I don't expect, from what we've seen so far, U.S. legislators to solve this themselves. I think what's going to happen is we'll have to call in some great thinkers or minds to help solve these problems. This process will have to be incentivized. People aren't going to do it for free. But we have great bodies, for example, like the World Economic Forum, or the Thinkers, the body is called, where I think they can at least help us establish some ethical guidelines that everyone can agree to. And I'm talking about people who are have respect in society, and who Mark Zuckerberg, who has a ego bigger than the Atlantic Ocean, excuse me for saying that, but we'll actually listen to and say that it's time to do something. I really like what Europe has done in terms of legislation, and I think it set the gold standard, and probably we're going to see that type of approach exported over the Atlantic to the United States. Facebook, Google, these companies spend tens of millions of dollars every year lobbying in Washington, D.C. The problem with the system, it's broken in the United States, where you can't get reelected without the support of some of these huge lobbying bodies. We don't have to name who they are, but they're very familiar to most people. So that's why, again, I'm a bit pessimistic that it'll be solved alone through the political process. But let's hope that Facebook and others have an epiphany, and they have the research in their hands. They can't say they're ignorant about it, and they'll do something to fix it.
And last question, there was also a suggestion to potentially end Facebook's monopoly through legislation, so break up the business, basically make them less powerful, because obviously they take data from Instagram, from Facebook, from WhatsApp, everywhere, and then when they correlate that, it becomes super powerful. So what's your take on that?
Well, look, was it 2 weeks ago already, we had that massive outage of all Facebook platforms. We have Facebook go down, Instagram, WhatsApp. So it shows their monopolistic power, but I also think that we should start viewing this company as a utility. It paralyzed a lot of businesses and individuals. In the midst of a pandemic, it's one of the worst things that you could possibly have happen. But then I think it also made people realize that, maybe life without social media or less social media would be good for me, number one. And number two is that maybe I should start hopping onto a platform that has better security, where my data isn't taken away and sold for profit. So Signal is one, for example. Fiber is another. So, maybe people will start looking at those platforms as well. But yeah, it wasn't a good day for Facebook for that to happen. But I'm hoping that it'll accelerate this kind of process where people are going to look at the company and say, well, it either needs to get rid of, because it's been done before with other big telecom companies, get rid of some of their businesses, and it's not going to be so concentrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's see how it will work out in the future. My concern is also that we ourselves are quite loyal customers, because even despite all these things that we've learned, Cambridge Analytica scandal to start with, etc., it hasn't really pushed that many people away from Facebook or Instagram. Quite the opposite. They keep getting new users and flourish.
Yeah, right. And, I hope there'll be more entrants into the space. There's an opportunity. There's huge innovation, for example, in this part of the world in the tech sector. So let's see what happens from that. In terms of backing up what I said about my skepticism for legislators to act, one of my favorite quotes from the book, it's on the back here, but I love this one. If it says that the COVID-19 pandemic response were an exam, many world leaders would have to cheat on their finals to obtain a passing grade. So, watching the way a lot of governments, including my own in Canada, fumbled the response to the pandemic, I don't want to leave on a pessimistic note, but it makes me wonder about how competent they are to solve a big problem like this. But let's keep our hopes high. But one last piece of advice, look, if you're using these platforms, start using these free apps to monitor how much time you're spending on it and what you're actually doing on it. And look, if there's one thing the pandemic taught us is that we're human beings that crave for human contact. So let's not waste too much time on the screen and interact like you and I are doing.
Yeah, and better read a book.
Better read the book.
Yes.
Pandemic. For those who are at the conference, we have them here.
Okay, thank you very much for tuning into our conversation, and I invite you to continue with the next panel of the Riga Conference.